Welcome to our business track of the Data Science Salon YouTube channel. This is a presentation by Rochelle Marsh, former data science manager at S&P Global. Her talk highlights how Trucost created the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, Analytics product. This talk also describes the process from conceptualizing an innovative financial product to using analysis tools to build it, and presents several new findings from analysis of the inaugural SDG dataset. Please enjoy.
So I'm Rochelle, and my formal title is a manager of ESG Innovation and Analytics at S&P Global. I work within the Trucost division that focuses on environmental, social, and governance data and analytics. And today I'm going to talk about aligning financial portfolios with global sustainability goals. This is a big focus of ours. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data we use for that and some new data sets that we've created recently. So for these slides, this is a quick abstract, but I'll go over this in detail throughout the presentation. And first, I wanted to just speak a little bit about the ESG, or Environmental Social Governance Product Innovation at S&P Global. This is kind of a more recent development as ESG data has become more important, more influential, and more prevalent. And it's something that disseminates throughout the entire organization. And my division, Trucost, serves kind of as a research and development hub for the creation of different ESG products and analytics. So we've got 4 different sub-companies, part of S&P Global: the ratings division, market intelligence, indices like the S&P 500 index, for example, and Platts, which is mostly commodities data. But through all of these, we're integrating different types of ESG metrics and analytics to bring that type of perspective to the market and to our customers. So ESG is kind of hitting a lot of headlines these days for a number of reasons. One, climate change is becoming pretty real for a lot of people. So is regulation increasing across the globe in terms of carbon taxes or other types of ESG disclosure like gender pay, for example, in the UK. And then most recently, we had the COVID-19 economic recession earlier this year, and we saw a lot of evidence that funds made up of companies that are high in ESG metrics actually outperformed a lot of traditional benchmarks like the S&P 500. So this chart here is showing you the S&P 500 in gray, and then everything above that had a lesser decrease during the recession, and all of those are strongly ESG-related funds. So traditionally, it was believed that in order to have environmental and social benefits, companies would have to pay for that. It came at a cost. It wasn't, a financially lucrative endeavor. But what we're seeing is this transition on focusing on these metrics is actually creating companies that are adaptable and resilient and actually outperforming the market. So now we are starting to see a real financial case for adopting some of these metrics as well. So there's a lot of acronyms. There's ESG. I'm going to talk actually mostly about the SDGs, which is a broad framework around sustainability that was issued in 2015 by the United Nations. But unlike many UN initiatives, there was a lot of engagement from the corporate sector and the private sector to help shape these goals. And these goals, which are 17 goals here, that articulate a sustainability agenda by the year 2030, are really broad and wide-reaching and cover everything from health to clean energy to more just institutions, but all things that really align with this ESG framework as well. And a lot of metrics are capturing these pieces too. The SDG framework is arguably a little bit more holistic and society focused, while ESG is a little bit more business and private sector focused. So this is an excellent framework to shape kind of the future we would want, but unfortunately there remains a really large funding gap in order to address these SDGs, couple $1 trillion. And this is because we don't have the proper metrics and the proper data to really measure these goals and put that capital allocation behind them. And that's where we tried to create a solution with our new SDG Analytics, which is a new data set and analysis product that helps articulate how a financial portfolio is contributing and also maybe detracting from the Sustainable Development Goals. So we launched this earlier this year, and here's a couple of examples of the different components. What you're seeing are the analytics from a financial portfolio analysis. The two to the left are looking at positive impact, while the one to the right is looking at risk exposure. And I'll go into these in more detail in a moment. So the first one is looking at SDG-aligned positive impact. And here we're actually looking at how companies are generating revenue and if they're generating revenue in a way that is beneficial to the SDGs. And essentially we map the sectors of a company. So let's take an energy company that's 50% solar and 50% coal. That 50% solar is going to be considered a positive impact. So relatively straightforward methodology, but we are looking at all sectors of all companies at a pretty granular level. And then we map that to our positive impact taxonomy, which is a list of different products and services that provide that type of positive impact, like clean energy, like vaccines, like medicine, but also other things you wouldn't expect, such as, financial services or telecommunications. Telecommunications and access to information and telecommunications is actually a really important target under SDG 5, gender equality. It's actually target 5.B. And it's talking about creating empowerment to women through access to technology. So, some of these things are not, as straightforward as we would think in terms of the sustainability nomenclature, but are arguably really important in terms of creating a more just, equal, and sustainable society. We use this to look at the positive impact of major benchmarks. So these are major S&P indexes around the world that capture many different companies in different regions. And, across the board, there's a lot of positive impact already happening. This chart here is breaking out the SDGs and showing you the percent per $1 million invested in these indexes. So the S&P ASX 200 is mostly Australia, TOPIX is more Japan, S&P 500 very US based, Europe 350, obviously Europe, and then the S&P Global is a global conglomeration of different companies, and within that 42% of those revenues are already aligned to the SDGs, which is good to see, but we can always increase that more. We also looked at what are the top countries with positive impact, and part of this is really looking at the amount of revenue that's going through these countries. So you can see right away that US and China is holding some of the top positions because these are just really large economies. But if you go down, there's some interesting exceptions as well. So for example, we've got Brazil coming along, which is a pretty big economy as well, and then smaller ones too. And all of these are based on the types of companies that are selling to these countries and operating in these countries. And this is interesting to look at because we also want to consider what countries need the most positive impact. So in the chart earlier, we have most of the developed economies, large countries, getting wealthier and wealthier, which is good. But this chart here is showing you where the most investment is really needed. So the darker blue here indicates the greater the need for progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see, Africa is quite saturated a bit in Central Asia, etc. So it's important to think about with financial portfolios, if you're creating positive impact, where is that impact flowing to? And are there opportunities to potentially create new markets for your positive impact products, maybe go in on some public financing to enter a new market that otherwise would be cost prohibitive? These are the types of things that we hope this type of analysis can unpack and help investors understand where are they actually making the best impact. So I talked a lot about positive impact, but on the flip side is this idea of risk exposure. So anytime a company is operating, whether it's sector or location, there's going to be an inherent level of risk, either from the company producing an impact, a negative impact in its surroundings, or it being impacted by it. So in the first example, perhaps a company is operating in a country with a large amount of labor rights abuses. This could be a risk where the company may also participate in that simply because that's the environment it's operating in. And that's where a company would need to make sure it has sufficient mitigation initiatives in place to combat any of that type of risk. But it's important to be aware of that risk in terms of a potentiality. On the flip side, climate change, for example, and vulnerability could be something that impacts a company itself. Just by where it's located, there's going to be some type of impact from typhoons or storms or droughts that could potentially impact the company in a negative way. So this is what the risk exposure metric is trying to capture. So here I have a couple of figures, and we actually looked at the S&P 500 risk exposure, and in the first one we're breaking it down by value chain stage. So operations often refers to the offices, the main operating locations by a company, maybe if it owns a manufacturing plant, but then it has its suppliers, which are all of its suppliers that it directly procures from. These would be, its vendors, its supply chain people, maybe outsourcing contractors, anybody that the company is procuring from. And this is interesting because you can see that, at least in the first chart, of all the companies in S&P 500, operations is relatively light risk. And then when you get into the supply chain, you start to see a greater risk indicated by the red coloring in a lot of the environmental SDGs, like SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, SDG 12, responsible production consumption, and then SDG 15, life on land. And that's probably predominantly from deforestation and land pollution. So you start to get a sense of, okay, maybe operations, not such a big risk, but what's happening with their suppliers? And could companies engage with suppliers to make sure that these risks are mitigated? We also broke it out in the below figure by sector. So here we're looking at metals and mining, real estate, and media and technology. And here you can see a pretty big differentiation between a resource-intensive sector like metals and mining that has pretty high risk, again, in a lot of the environmental SDGs like 6, 14, and 15. And then real estate and media and technology are a lot lighter. Although I thought it was interesting that media and technology has a little bit of a risk around SDG 5, gender equality. So this may point to an area of exploration to understand, based on that sector and kind of where that sector is operating, where is that risk coming from. So I'll talk a little bit about the technical approach for how we calculate this. This is where a lot of our programming comes in because there's quite a lot of data. We are actually building this risk exposure on top of a multi-regional input-output model. And this is actually an economic model that shows the exports and imports of many different countries and many different sectors. So in our case, we have about 189 countries represented with 26 industry sectors each. So that creates a matrix about 5,000 by 5,000 values, which can be quite big. And then we essentially extend that matrix or multiply that matrix by different SDG metrics that we map to the SDGs. In our case, we have about 45 different metrics that has enough data on the country and sector specificity, and that is also related to the SDGs. So this is relatively straightforward, but it's just a large data set, and it's pretty helpful to use something like Python or R to manipulate it. So essentially, we input the multi-regional input-output model. We are able to convert it from a couple of calculations, kind of traditional economic calculations called Leontief inverse. And by doing this, we're able to get the supply chain impact from the transaction of finances between sectors. And this is really helpful because companies may have data on operations, but very little have anything with their supply chain, and practically never pass their direct suppliers. So by doing this calculation, we're able to understand what is the tier N supplier impact. So not just the cafeteria food that is served in the office, but the farm where that food comes from, the mines that the fertilizer is mined from, et cetera, all the way down, to really understand that total impact. And then we're also able to invert it in a way that shows us the downstream impact a bit. So of those offices, what is the end of life? What is the consumer part, based off of that operational value chain stage as well. So we do that, and then we essentially extend all of those different value chain matrices by the SDG-related metrics, and then that gives us kind of a huge data frame or tibble that is kind of encapsulating the global risk for all of these different metrics for all countries and all sectors around the world. And then when we take a specific company, we look at what sector it's in and what country it's in, and it could be a combination of many different sectors and countries as well. And we essentially look at the percentile rank of its risk exposure compared to the worst sector and country in the world. And that way we're able to get an exposure value normalized from 0 to 100, 100 being the highest risk and 0 being the lowest risk. So just some final slides showing some exploratory data analysis of this data. So this is the risk exposure data, just with a couple sectors, but kind of articulating the difference that you can see. And here we looked at our current SDG company universe, which includes 3,500 companies, and looking across all SDGs. So the x-axis here is the risk exposure, 0 being the lowest, so to the left, and 80 or 100 being the highest to the right. And so it's good to see that, low impact industries like insurance, for example, and telecommunication services are more to the left. They're having a lighter impact, although you can see quite a distribution, particularly with insurance and telecommunication. And I think partly that's because some of these companies have many different sectors. So some of the sectors that compile the company may be in heavier industries, for example. And sometimes there's just a range as well across sectors in terms of their impact. Could be operating in a riskier country, for example. Meanwhile, the automobile and component and the materials is much more to the right, showing a higher risk, as these are more resource intensive, bigger footprint, maybe mining or working in areas that are going to have higher human rights risks. So kind of just showing you the range and the distribution of some of the data points here. We also broke this out by value chain stage, which is really interesting. Traditionally, or historically, ESG metrics were only really able to capture operational risks or operational metrics, what happens within the four walls of the company. But more and more, it's really important to capture the supply chain. If you think of a food and beverage company, the operation risk or impact is not that big compared to the huge amount of water and GHG emissions and labor rights risks that could be inherent in, say, the farmland and the supply chain, and so on. So in these charts here, we're comparing tier 1 suppliers, so that's direct supplier on the y-axis, and then the operational exposure on the x-axis. So you can think of it as, direct operations versus the direct suppliers. And here too, you can see that food and beverage is a little to the left in terms of operational exposure, but definitely the highest in tier 1 or the suppliers. So my earlier example is reflected in this type of data here. You can see the red cluster to the top. Meanwhile, financial services, pretty low impact, pretty distributed throughout, to be honest, but the similarity between their operational risk and their supply risk is pretty close. And that's just telling us that the type of activities that they operate within versus the type of activities they procure from are pretty similar. Same thing with post and telecommunications. And then agriculture, you can see that the operations is pretty high, and so is the supply chain. And that's good to see because obviously agriculture is a really intensive industry as well. There's going to be a lot of different environmental and social risks, but also agriculture is going to be procuring from fertilizers, petroleum, different other types of industries that are also intensive, reflected by that high tier 1 exposure as well. And then to the right, just showing again an example of agriculture, mining and quarrying, and food and beverage. And you can see again that food and beverage is high in the supply chain and pretty low in operations. And then mining and quarrying and agriculture, both kind of really intensive industries on the ground, are kind of more to the right in terms of operational risk. So these are many different components that fit into our data set because we really hope that the Sustainable Development Goals could provide that critical focus needed to consider the positive impact of different types of strategies that are regenerative and more sustainable alongside traditional financial measurements. So at True Cost, we really try and marry traditional financial analysis with kind of the nuance of ecosystems and societies in order to compare them on the same page. So here's just an example of what a final portfolio analysis would look like. Here we're just showing the positive impact pieces, but different types of metrics that would be reflected in a traditional portfolio analysis, but converted in a way that makes the SDGs more understandable. So with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you so much for listening today, and happy to answer any questions.
That was a presentation by Rochelle Marge, former data science manager at S&P Global, on the SDG Analytics product, and described the process from conceptualizing an innovative financial product to using analysis tools to build it, and presented several new findings of the inaugural SDG dataset. If you enjoyed that presentation, please feel free to subscribe to our channel below. Thank you.